Hi, in this video I'm going to talk about work on the Ordinal Society, which is a new way of thinking about how capitalism works today. I'm going to focus upon the work of Marion Fourcade and colleagues. She's been particularly influential in the sociology of and anthropology of this area. So she's written lots of quite influential papers with a bunch of colleagues over the years, and one of the readings this week is Society of Algorithms, which I think is a particularly good one. And also particularly the wonderful book that she's written with Kieran Healy called The Ordinal Society. I see the Ordinal Society in kind of a lineage of what's quite kind of common big sociological works that try and define particular eras and try and understand how social change has happened and what this means for the norms and conditions that we live by. There's a long tradition of this. More recent stuff in the 90s, there was stuff like Eric Beck's Risk Society or Zygmunt Bauman's Liquid Modernity. Maybe more relevant for this course would be Manuel Castell's huge trilogy on the Information Age and the Network Society. More recently, there's been work, trying to grapple with this kind of increasing dominance and immersion of digital cultures and, platform cultures and things like that. A few years ago, Mackenzie Walk wrote what I think is a particularly really good update of kind of Marxist ideas on this, asking a very key question, is capitalism dead? Have we moved on to something worse? And he proposed that there's a kind of new vectoral layer over top of the kind of current means of production. Marx talks about the means of production, about, those who own the factories and the lands and whatever there is in terms of across the globe to kind of, make things that we live by. Increasingly, that's become informational and financial. It's not necessarily about making stuff anymore. And therefore, we have this new class relation, what Walk called the vectoralists versus the hackers. In the work I'm going to talk about today, there's a similar thing going on. Burrell and Fourcade's work, for instance, talks about this new class relation between the coding elite and the cybertariat, kind of new version of ruling class and working class, or bourgeoisie and proletariat. So I'll start by talking a little bit about the paper to begin with, so that's set as one of the readings this week. And essentially, like much of the work we're looking at throughout the course, it's trying to, critically engage with the implications of these, new technologies that we're living our lives on and through and with, and what these major social implications are. Like a lot of these works, they tend to kind of then name the society through that lens. And I always find this a little bit oversimplistic. Risk society or liquid modernity, information age, ordinal society, they tend to kind of give us, critical understandings of a lot of stuff going on, but they tend to be, miss things, oversimplify or whatever. And I think, there tends to be, I think we should maybe be a little bit more modest about making those claims as sociologists rather than saying society is now like this kind of society. Nevertheless, I think that works like this are also really important because they allow us to kind of look at things through a new lens, do that kind of classic sociological move of making the normal look strange, and give us a kind of language and kind of concepts to be able to engage with what's going on. So, they have their pluses and minuses in that sense. What the Society of Algorithms shows, and like this kind of work you'll see becomes a lens to that comes back a lot throughout the rest of the course, is the way that kind of data, algorithms, AI, whatever, are increasingly being implemented across a bunch of domains just beyond, social media or being online. They're coming to dominate education, medicine, credit, finance, criminal justice, policing, and increasingly, things like border control, weapons, welfare, warfare. So whenever there's kind of huge social changes like this, and sociologists start to come to think about what this means to be a human being. How do we live? How do we interact, associate, and think? How this affects our very subjectivity. The paper, the article from a few years ago, that's the reading. At the time, I was kind of questioning what's going on here. What's the coding elite? The new ruling class. What's their ultimate goal here? What are they doing with these algorithms? And it seems a bit opaque and uncertain at the moment. More recently, it seems to be pretty obvious what's going on here. They're trying to essentially build a new society where these people dominate, where they control us, where they kind of essentially make money through datafication of our lives and the financialization of everything, which we'll look at again in more detail throughout the course. And this becomes particularly obvious when, when you see, the rise of the tech bros in the White House and stuff like that. The, in a way, the kind of stuff that Mackenzie Walk was talking about, the kind of new means of production, the vectorless layer over the kind of the older materials layer, kind of, come together when you see, Donald Trump next to Elon Musk or whatever. They're kind of two good symbols, I think, of those things, of those different levels of capitalism. So they talk about Burrell and Fourcade, talk about this kind of new class relationship, a core divide happening across the globe between the coding elite and the cybertariat. And this kind of model echoes a lot of the earlier work in some of those other texts I was talking about. Castells had his own model of a new kind of class relationship. Beck and Bauman do as well, and many of these kind of sociologists that kind of want to define eras, kind of come up with new class systems. But here the coding elite, is a kind of the tech industry titans, but also not just those kind of billionaires, the kind of highly paid, highly skilled kind of coding elite, that are professors, engineering professors, computer scientists. The financialization of this is really important as well. So the finance sector is very much implicated in this kind of coding elite. So here the most valued skills are increasingly those who can touch, understand, create, manipulate computer code. But the most powerful are those that not only can maybe code, but also employs others to do it and kind of own the mechanisms and the platforms to be able to do so. Everyone else that's not part of that, like the kind of former ruling class versus working class model, is the cybertariat. And increasingly, people at the lower end of the tech industry are in the cybertariat, and everyone else kind of outside of it are part of that as well. This is particularly the case and important, I suppose, when we start to think about how much of the work going on, being driven by the coding elite, seems to be about automating many of those jobs that, in the cybertariat. So this has kind of potential ramifications for everyone that's not part of that class. Importantly, what this work also points out is the way that kind of knowledge and legitimacy are changing in terms of what's going on in the world at the moment. So claims of technical and economic efficiency, as well as fairness, are an important component of what the coding elite's societal power is. They're kind of claiming a lot of the kind of PR claims that they're kind of making the world better. They're going to eradicate climate change. They're going to make Mars occupiable. They're going to create tools for us to kind of work less and all this kind of stuff. But these claims are increasingly seen to be kind of hollow claims. And again, we'll be looking at that throughout the course. But in terms of the legitimacy itself, increasing legitimacy seems to be based on algorithms and data, which is an extension of the expertise of those in the coding elite. What's important about the change there in terms of how kind of cultures develop and how knowledge work and how things become legitimated is that, much in the past, much of the way that things were legitimated were in the kind of well-educated, white-collar middle classes. So, things like the legal system and education systems, the medical systems, criminal justice systems, social welfare, business management. These were, relatively highly educated, well-paid people. What's increasingly happening, though, is these kind of different fields and spheres and institutions are becoming increasingly influenced by the coding elite, the engineering kind of algorithms that kind of takes away some of the power and expertise from those highly trained kind of white-collar professionals and kind of gives it back to these, not back, gives it to the professions that are kind of making the tools. And again, there's this kind of weird irony here that like some industries, such as the legal profession, for instance, that might be integrating AI into some of their work practices, will mean it might make some of the jobs in that industry irrelevant. Same with education, and increasingly kind of bringing in big platforms and AI to kind of be able to perform various aspects of educational systems more efficiently, in inverted commas. But this then very much threatens the basic premises of what education is, and may threaten the very jobs of those that work in those situations. So again, according to this point of view, no profession, no matter how prestigious or how high the barrier is to entry at the moment or in the past, is exempt from having its judgment, its legitimacy, its power, to a second algorithmic opinion, if not wholly supplanted by it. And this is a really, I think, an interesting understanding of how power is starting to shift through different sections of society. And I like this quote here too: legitimacy has been displaced from the professional to the coder king, and is increasingly therefore being kind of handed over to the algorithm, which is something that we've looked at in the course already, and we'll look at a lot more throughout the course as well. So this kind of relates again back to that actuarialism logic that we've looked at already, and again, there's kind of debates about how responsible it is to hand decision making over to this kind of very much quantified and very often dehumanized logic. The diffusion of algorithmic methods are across a range of occupational jurisdictions, including retail, transportation, insurance, social work, medicine, banking, police, and the judicial system. And there's promises about this stuff, about making it more fair, maybe more efficient, quicker, all this kind of stuff. But there's also pitfalls. Um, Really, a lot of the kind of actual research in how this affects the people in those systems, or how it affects people that are kind of affected by those systems, seems to show that time and again, what algorithmic judgments do is just recreate current historical inequalities, and if anything, make the lines between those things even harder. So I've got a bunch of quotes here for you to look at. These are kind of drawn out of the reading, I think. Um, and it's kind of highlighting the different way that these algorithmic processes come to kind of structure our daily day lives and affect the way that we relate to each other and the way that we start to think about ourselves and community. This is particularly important when we think about how these systems are kind of based on prediction. Predicting the future on the basis of the past really threatens to kind of harden and reproduce and reify existing inequalities. It relates to that kind of garbage in, garbage out model of what it means in terms of big data and how algorithms are working. In this sense, digital coding becomes a new conduit for the familiar operations of race, gender, and class structures. And we'll look at specific examples of how that works throughout the course. This is particularly obvious when it comes to kind of the criminal justice system and particularly policing. The more and more this stuff is automated, the more and more it's dehumanized, and the more and more it reproduces what were already very unequal and discriminatory policies. Based on previous, crime statistics and deciding who's getting treatment now, we know that crime statistics are always massively overbiased in terms of targeting on particular racial groups or poverty groups. We know that policing tends to target those groups in a way that actually then increases those statistics. If you target a particular group, you're going to bust them for more things. If the police, for instance, started that, they could go into houses in the North Shore and just bust people taking, cocaine in their house. All of a sudden, that group would have like a higher rate of cocaine use. When it comes to drug taking, though, people get busted when they're doing it on the street, and that tends to be the way that poor people take drugs. It's not whether kind of different sections are taking more or less illegal drugs. The attitude of the policing towards that action tends to have real effects on how the statistics work. And if those statistics are then fed into the machine, when we know those statistics don't really represent, reality or justice, these machines therefore just replicate those problems. Another example here is that, like, if these various machines, whatever they are kind of trained on mostly white and relatively privileged data, it means those systems then might not even see dominated groups at all, so they're just completely excluded. A really good example of that is like the machine learning based algorithm that now reviews many jobs. Many jobs now are just reviewed by AIs, and CVs are kind of ranked in an ordinal way without a human reading them, and then the kind of decisions to make to who's going to be interviewed happens after that. Amazon did that and like just kind of reinforced the fact that they hired more men and kind of gave lower scores to women based on the data that was fed from what was happening in that company in the past. Importantly, I think, and this speaks, we'll do a whole week on this. The Ordinal Society book highlights how much financialization is happening as part of this digitalization. The more and more data that's developed, the more and more it's bought and sold and used to kind of understand us in various ways, seems to lead to the more and more ways that kind of different aspects of our lives are financialized. That we have to pay kind of subscriptions or kind of different ways that companies can get a little cut out of our life for us to pay to things. So we'll look at that in some detail later on. Everything you do on the internet is monetized, even if you're not paying it. paying for it. So, the well-worn quip now that if you're not paying for something on the internet, you're the product. So if you're online on any of the social media sites and doing stuff, you're actually like doing work for the site because you're creating data. So your life in that sense is being monetized. You're not necessarily paying for it, but you are kind of providing labor for these systems in that sense. Obviously, then, there's all kind of other ways that that's going on as well in terms of the things we do buy, the things we have to subscribe to, become part of this financialization process of everyday life as well. More and more aspects of our life, we have to subscribe to things. In terms of the future, social scientists kind of debate whether we should be predicting the future, which, if we're going to criticize, algorithmic societies for kind of maybe being a bit dodgy for relying on prediction, maybe we should think about that ourselves. But sometimes it's like hard not to wonder how things are going to work out in the future based on how they are now. In the Fourcade and Healy book, in the book here, The Ordinal Society, they point towards, um, life will be maybe will end up being this complete cyborg self, this algorithmically cyborg self, a kind of more positive future where, things are kind of the technology kind of works out for us. It also means probably millions of people are excluded for that, but particularly privileged people in the West will see that. The other leads to this kind of parallel disembodied thing where we kind of live our lives IRL in meat space and we're kind of humans with a body, but we also have this kind of data self going on as well, which we'll talk about in much more detail as well. So I'm just kind of flagging this now because I think those kind of two alternate futures are unlikely to be separate. I reckon they're both going to kind of happen at once. But there'll be other things going on as well. Um, and I've been kind of talking about that parallel disembodied thing in some of my own work as our data zombie, and I'll be unpacking that a lot more throughout the course as well. Okay, I'm going to leave it there. Thanks.